Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. This week we will be continuing our introductory series on Buddhism and discussing the first sermon. What did the Buddha preach in the first sermon? What are the Four Noble Truths? What is the Eightfold Path? We hope you enjoy.
What did the Buddha preach in the first sermon?
To start, I'll give a short introduction to the sermon and its position in the overall landscape of Buddhist teachings. The first sermon is known in Pali as the Dhammacakkappavattana Suta, which translates to the Discourse on the Turning of the Dharma Wheel. For shorthand, we call it the first sermon. The Dharma Wheel is a concept in Buddhism referring to the proliferation of Buddhist teaching and practice in the world. In this context, the word Dharma is spelled with a capital D and refers to the Buddha's teaching. For more on the definition of Dharma, please see episode 9, What is Dharma? Link in the show notes. If people are studying, practicing, and transmitting what the Buddha taught, then the Dharma Wheel is thought to be spinning. It is like the cycle of reception and transmission. The Dharma Wheel gets turned by the Buddha anytime he teaches something new and important, and so during the lifetime of the Buddha, he is said to have turned the Dharma Wheel 2 to 3 times. The first time is this sermon, the second time is when he taught the Prajnaparamita, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and the third is when he taught mind-only doctrines, which are very important to Yogacara Buddhists. When the Dharma Wheel stops spinning, a new Buddha has to come in and teach the Dharma again. Since our historical Buddha has died, the next Buddha to come in and preach when this Dharma Wheel stops will be Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. The Buddha famously gave the first sermon in the deer park at Sarnath, 5 miles northeast of Varanasi in India. This site has become very popular as a pilgrimage site alongside where the Buddha was born, where he died, and where he reached enlightenment. Before he reached enlightenment, the Buddha had practiced 2 extreme forms of asceticism with 2 well-renowned thinkers in the Indian religious landscape. However, he didn't find what he was looking for with them, and so resolved to meditate under a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya until he reached enlightenment. He sat for 49 days and nights, until finally he reached full enlightenment. He sought to go talk to his former teachers and companions, but found that his teachers had died while he was meditating. His companions prompted him to teach, and they had to ask him 3 times before he did. The first time he refused, saying, "No, it's too hard to communicate what I have experienced." The second time he refused, explaining, "People don't have the capacity to understand it and practice it. They're too misguided by their own selfishness." On the third time, he finally relented and decided to preach. The first sermon was either the first or the second sermon that the Buddha gave immediately after reaching enlightenment and being prompted to teach others. Some, notably Huayan and some Mahayana Buddhists, think what we're calling the first sutra was really the second thing he preached, and that the actual first sermon he gave was the Avatamsaka Sutra, also called the Flower Garland Sutra. We've read and discussed chapter 30 of this sutra in a previous episode, which will also be linked in the show notes. The Flower Garland Sutra is incredibly complicated and difficult to understand. It's around 1,100 pages in English translation, making it one of the longest sermons in the whole canon. The story goes that the Buddha initially tried to communicate the experience of enlightenment via the Flower Garland Sutra, but his audience couldn't follow along for the many hours or days that it took to preach the entire sermon, and they didn't know how most of the stuff that he discussed worked. This alienated some of his early followers. Then he was asked to make it easier to understand, and thus preach the sermon that we're discussing today, which is much shorter and much more straightforward. Most Buddhists outside of the Huayan sect agree that the first sutra was literally the first thing the Buddha preached, and it contains the simplest and most direct distillation of the Dharma in the form of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. These are considered the most essential arguments and prescriptions in the entirety of the Dharma. Once these are truly realized and applied to life, it is thought that one is firmly on the path to enlightenment. They're the most straightforward presentation of what the Buddha experienced when he reached his own enlightenment. Thus, this sermon serves as a foundation and a starting point for all other sermons in the Buddhist canon. Every other sutra builds directly on or responds to what has been posed in this first sermon. If somebody only encounters Buddhism in a passing fashion, these are the 2 most important things to take away from it. When asked, "What is Buddhism?" Many people, both inside and outside of Buddhism, will say it's the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Every single other concept or teaching in Buddhism can be related back to these somehow.
We're about to play a recitation of the first sutra. There are many words and concepts in the text English listeners probably won't know, so I want to define a few words used frequently. If we went into every one, we'd be here all day, so we're focusing on words you'll need to understand the main points. Don't worry too much about the other details. Bhikku, a Buddhist monk. When he says bhikkhus in this text, he is referring to the 5 people he's preaching to. Tathagata, a title for the Buddha, he is referring to himself. Suffering, the usual translation of the word dukkha. We'll go into this in more detail after the reading, but keep in mind that this translation is shaky as you listen. Nibbana, the Pali word for nirvana, a state where one is free from the cycle of samsara. Samsara, the cycle of birth and reincarnation. It's a whole capital T thing, but for now, this is reality. We are in samsara right now. Khandana, this is the name of one of the bhikkhus. Now we will listen to a recitation of the first sutra in full. We are using an English translation by Bhikku Bodhi. If you want to read along, just search for First Sutra Bhikku Bodhi. That is spelled B-I-K-K-H-U-B-O-D-H-I.
Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5 thus. Bhikkhus, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. And what, bhikkhus, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana? It is the Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This, bhikkhus, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is the Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the noble truth of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering has been abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering has been realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering has been developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So long, bhikkhus, as my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths as they really are, in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, was not thoroughly purified in this way, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. But when my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths as they really are, in their 3 phases and 12 aspects was thoroughly purified in this way, then I claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. The knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. This is what the Blessed One said. Elated, the bhikkhus of the group of 5 delighted in the Blessed One's statement. And while this discourse was being spoken, there arose in the Venerable Kondana the dust-free, stainless vision of the Dhamma. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. And then the wheel of the Dhamma had been set in motion by the Blessed One. The earth-dwelling devas raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin, or Deva or Mara, or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. Having heard the cry of the earth-dwelling devas, the devas in the realm of the 4 great kings raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin, or Deva, or Mara, or by anyone in the world. Having heard the cry of the devas of the realm of the 4 great kings, the Tavatimsa devas, the Yama devas, the Tushita devas, the Nimanarati devas, the Paranimita Vasavati devas, the devas of the Brahma's company, raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin, or Deva, or Mara, or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. Thus, at that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry spread as far as the Brahma world, and this 10,000-fold world system shook, quaked, and trembled, and an immeasurable glorious radiance appeared in the world, surpassing the divine majesty of the devas. Then the Blessed One uttered this inspired utterance. Kondana has indeed understood. Kondana has indeed understood. In this way, the Venerable Kondana acquired the name Anakondana, Kondana who has understood.
So getting back into the normal flow of the show, let's explain a bit about what we just heard. Nick, what are the Four Noble Truths?
The Four Noble Truths are declarative statements about the nature of all reality by the Buddha. They are the central worldview of most, if not all, Buddhists about the way the world is and how it works. They're called noble in two possible senses of the word. One, that they are noble in the fact that the Buddha is the first one to pose them in this way to us. Thus they are noble in their veracity and their suitability to our current situation. The other sense is that they are only suited to noble people who have done away with their own false views and misguided understandings of the world and now favor the Buddha's teaching. They are 1. Dukkha. Existence is marked by an unshakable unsatisfactoriness. This word is often translated as suffering, but we've discussed many times on this show that while suffering is included in the range of experiences covered by dukkha, the word suffering has a very strongly negative connotation of abject pain and ongoing distress. But positive experiences like euphoria, joy, and happiness can be dukkha as well. The reason why these are both dukkha is because we desire not to have any pain, and we desire to have permanent pleasure, but neither state of being is possible. Dukkha refers to the fact that the world is what it is, and it isn't perfect.
In fact, it kinda sucks right now.
Things are impermanent, and this causes anxiety, pain, and unsatisfactoriness. The truth of dukkha is to be fully understood. All of existence, all of our experience in it, and everything that is marked by dukkha. It cannot be avoided, and it cannot be fundamentally changed. This has led some people encountering Buddhism to think that it's overly negative and world-negating, because they think that it says, life is suffering and there's nothing good about it. This is not true at all. For more on this, you can check out episode 95, Does Buddhism Reject the World? Link in the show notes. 2. Samudaya. The origin of dukkha is desire, thirst, and craving. This word, samudaya, is translated as origin, cause, or arising. We become emotionally attached to things that are inherently impermanent, fleeting, insubstantial, and unsatisfactory, and this is the root cause of dukkha. I'm strongly attached to my cats, and I want them to live forever. And when they inevitably pass away, I'll be left with dukkha, an experience that the world simply does not match up to my desires for how I want it to be. There's a discrepancy between that which I want, namely the absence of pain and the eternal presence of pleasure, and that which is, the presence of pain and the impermanence of pleasure, of all things. Desire traps us in a cycle. We desire something,
or the absence of something,
we get it in a transient fashion,
or avoid it for a while,
and then we lose it.
Or it shows up,
we want it again,
or we really want it gone,
or we want it more,
etc.
In Buddhism, desire can be for a specific or individual thing, like money, or it can be for an abstract idea, like painless existence or immortality. But all of these, all desires in general, are regarded as being the cause of dukkha. 3. Nirodha. Luckily for us, there is an end to dukkha. This word is often translated as cessation. It speaks to the fact that if we remove the roots of this desire, thirst, or craving for the world to be a particular way that it is not, then we can simultaneously end dukkha. If you take away the cause for something's continued existence, that thing will go away. And the cause of dukkha is desire. So take desire away and dukkha will cease as well. 4. Marga. The way to remove desire, and thus end dukkha, is to follow the Eightfold Path. Marga is translated as path of study and practice, and this leads directly into the Eightfold Path.
What is the Eightfold Path?
The Eightfold Path is a step-by-step outline for what needs to be done in one's life to eliminate desire, craving, and thirst, which will result in the elimination of dukkha. These are characteristics of a person who practices perfect morality, which is necessary to remove desire and dukkha. There are 8 aspects to our lived experience that need to be addressed in order to achieve freedom from desire and dukkha, and they lead into each other in a causal fashion. They are each presented with a moral qualifier, and this speaks to how there is a specific moral backbone for how to be and how to act in Buddhism. The Eightfold Path is also regarded as a noble path, like the Four Noble Truths are regarded as noble, and in both senses like before. The path is 1. Right view. This aspect of the path challenges you to reassess your views on the world and realign them with Buddhist views of the world. To remove desire, and therefore to end dukkha, one must correctly understand the existence of dukkha and how it functions in the world. On the extreme end, a wrong view could be believing evil things, like that stealing, killing, lying, and cheating are absolutely morally good, when in reality, they are not absolutely totally morally good. On a less extreme scale, a wrong view would be like believing karma or rebirth isn't real, believing that impermanence is false and incorrect, believing that the Buddha is not enlightened, etc. On the Buddhist path, one's views must be fundamentally addressed through study of the texts and through meditation, because one's views lead causally into one's intention, or resolve, which is the next step. People make decisions for how to act in the world based on their views about it, and so in order to change one's intention, one must change their views. 2. Right resolve or right intention. Knowing about karma and rebirth and viewing the world through that lens, one must resolve not to do morally bad things. For example, intending to harm living things unnecessarily is morally bad. It leads to bad karma and rebirth in Buddhist hell realms, perpetuating the cycle of samsara. Thus, by taking up right view, you would make your resolve not to harm any living things unnecessarily. This applies to all sorts of views and moral prescriptions in Buddhism. If you view the world through the lens of dukkha, then your resolve would be to lessen the dukkha of people and living things around you through compassion and loving kindness. For some Buddhists, right resolve is regarded as the resolve to leave home, renounce, and become a disciple of the Buddha. Resolve is important because it causes our speech and our behavior, leading to 3. Right speech. If we perfect our resolve to act morally, then our speech must be perfected morally. If our resolve is not to harm sentient beings unnecessarily, then we must not speak to cause harm. This could be by lying, trying to cause fights, idle or pointless chatter, or speaking abusively. Our speech must be compassionate and kind. 4. Right action. Just like with right speech, our actions must also be morally perfected. This means resolving not to kill, steal, harm, commit sexual misconduct, or anything like that. This is based on our resolve being corrected and is concurrent with our speech. Our actions must be perfected because they altogether constitute our livelihood, our lifeway, or the sum total of what we do throughout our lives. 5. Right livelihood. If we morally perfect our actions and speech, then our livelihood will also be morally perfected. This means not making a living or lifestyle out of killing, hunting, lying, cheating, stealing, or committing sexual misconduct. These things cause harm and are morally bad as a result. As a result of being morally bad, they worsen one's karma and lead to rebirths in lower realms. Our livelihoods must be perfected because they direct our effort, or what we're trying to accomplish with our lives, and our numerous rebirths. 6. Right effort. Our livelihoods are goal-oriented. On an individual level, that goal is continued existence, survival, and accrual of some amount of material wealth and comfort. In a broader sense, we could ask, what are we working toward with all that we do? Are we trying to shape the world into being a certain way for everybody? Are we trying to help or harm all people or a group of people? Does what I do with my life every day have morally good outcomes or not? Does my effort only go to improving my own circumstances? By answering these questions, we can judge whether our effort is morally perfected. The effort of a Wall Street stockbroker is to accumulate wealth for themselves and their clients. This is potentially immoral because it worsens inequality and inequity, and it perpetuates oppression, which is morally wrong. The effort of a soldier is to kill people who are deemed enemies, whether that is for justified or unjustified reasons. This is immoral because to harm sentient beings is morally wrong in Buddhism. These are just a couple of examples. In Buddhism, right effort is that which leads to decreased dukkha for all living beings. If we perfect our efforts, then we have begun to perfect our mindfulness, because to even know one's effort requires mindfulness. 7. Right mindfulness. This is sometimes regarded as simply being conscious of what you're doing. For example, driving a car mindfully means focusing on the road and not driving carelessly. However, it applies to moral behavior as well. If you have morally perfected your mindfulness, you'll be aware of immoral actions, thoughts, words, livelihoods, and efforts, and thus be able to stop these things and cultivate morally good ones. You'll be able to maintain the rightness of the first 6 aspects of the Eightfold Path because you'll be aware of that which is right and that which isn't in the Buddhist sense and be able to act accordingly. This is a morally attuned self-awareness. This must be perfected if one is to practice Buddhism correctly, and to practice Buddhism correctly is right samadhi. 8. Right samadhi. Samadhi is translated as meditative concentration, but it also refers to all mental and contemplative practices of Buddhism. For more on the meaning of samadhi, check out episode 72, What is Samadhi in Buddhism? Link in the show notes. What makes samadhi morally right is when it is done with the goal and the purpose of cultivating loving kindness, compassion, and non-violence. It is morally right when you are practicing samadhi to address your morally unwholesome or morally wrong views, feelings, inclinations, and more to make them morally right. Part of the purpose of samadhi is to fundamentally realign your beliefs and views about yourself and the world around you, so the perfection of this one causes the perfection of your views, closing the circle of the Eightfold Path. This Eightfold Path, together with the Four Noble Truths, is what is presented in the first sermon. I gave some additional context and explanation that isn't present in the sutra, but is found in later sutras and elaborations of the Buddha's teaching. The first sermon itself is quite short and easy to read, and I highly recommend that you go back to it and check it out. It is available online for free in many different languages, and we also read and discuss it in its entirety on this episode and in one of our earlier sutra episodes, so I recommend checking those out as well.
For our first episode discussing the first sutra, the material was mostly new to me. I'd seen the basics in other reading I'd done before joining this podcast, but that was my first time examining the whole thing. If there are things in the sutra we didn't get into here that you wish we had discussed, we might have gone into it back then. Between now and then, we have talked a lot about different types of Buddhism on this show. Many interpretations outright contradict each other, a few vehemently so. But now that I've come back and re-examined this sutra, it's clear that different writers came to very different conclusions, but they got there from this same starting point. Later sutras may contradict each other, but they are generally compatible with this one.
It's true. These teachings and these truths never really get challenged or contested. They may be reframed or recontextualized to be compatible with a different outlook on the Buddhist path, but the material serves as the singular foundation for all the different schools of Buddhism.
We hope you enjoyed this week's introductory discussion of the first sermon. For next week, we're going to discuss some temporary changes coming to the show in the near future. We'll explain then. For now, thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Well, Hearer, it seems our meandering has brought us back to where we began.
Indeed. It seems that is often the way of things.
There is a philosopher I read about in my time before studying the Dharma. He argued that all great stories refer to the same hero with 1,000 faces, whose journeys go in a circle, ending where they began. I don't like his framing and conclusions, and some part of me winces at how smug his advocates would be that I've replicated his path in spite of my distaste for it. But applying what we've just read, I think the rest of me would say that spiteful part needs to meditate a little longer on right view.
I imagine so. I think there is use in visiting places of beginning after a long journey. If nothing else, it shows one how far they've come. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.